Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another Rational Basis. I'm John DePippa, and with me is Wendell Griffin. And
Hello, everybody.
we want to talk today about fascism, and specifically how fascism has arrived in the United States. Now, a lot of people, and I was one of them for the longest time, objected to using the F word to describe the Trump administration. But it's unavoidable right now. And if you look at the history of fascism and its elements, you see it playing out today. So, Judge Griffin and I are going to talk about what we see happening and how we think those are the elements of fascism that are here right now in the United States, and that it's too late for us to pretend that this is an overreaction. So, let me just talk about a couple of things. And I think we can see three elements of fascism. One is what you might call racial solidarity or white supremacy joined in one. And you see elements of that in the Trump administration's attack on DEI and Trump's recent statement about how poorly treated white people have been since the Civil Rights Act. The second thing is you see the imperial expansion designs of this administration. Greenland is just one of them, but there are others. And the third feature of fascism is a strong man rule, a single strong ruler running the country. And Trump, if you notice, said he's now the acting president of Venezuela. Apparently, it's not enough for him to be the current president of the United States. So we see those three elements coursing through all the activities of the administration right now. And so, Judge Griffin, you and I, before we got here, started talking about the imperial aims of the United States and how this isn't a recent development. And it really is the continuation of the neocon agenda from 25, 30 years ago. Is that right?
Yes, we like to talk about things in current events as if they are popcorn. They just pop up and they happen. But the truth is that current realities actually have percolated over time. And the imperialism that Dean DePippa mentioned and the fascist trend with it have actually been percolating in American foreign policy and American domestic policy for quite some time. Some of us remember Pat Buchanan, who was part of Ronald Reagan's and Richard Nixon's administrations. But Pat Buchanan was a very vocal strongman advocate. And before Fox News, before Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, was on CNN and was pushing the Republican Party toward a strongman, anti-immigrant, white sort of nationalist, Christian conservative kind of agenda that people sort of laughed at, poo-pooed about,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and tried to Pat Buchanan off. But Pat Buchanan didn't go away. He actually became part of the conversation. Rupert Murdoch picked this up, and Fox News picked it up, and we see now the Pat Buchanan language is really tame compared to uh, what we see now with J.D. Vance or Stephen Miller, and so that situation. But the last thing I'll say is we forget that 20 years after Pat Buchanan, neocons were pushing Bill Clinton in 1998 to topple Saddam Hussein. I'm looking at a letter dated January 26, 1998, written by a host of characters, Elliot Abrams, Donald Rumsfeld, and others, calling on it to be the aim of the American foreign policy needs to be to topple, remove Saddam Hussein and his regime from power.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we did. It didn't happen during the Clinton administration. Did it in the Bush administration. But before we got to the Bush administration, we had the Brooks Brothers riot in the 2000 election of white, well-dressed people from Washington who came in and stopped voting counting in Florida. This was fascism working in plain sight, but it wasn't called that.
That's right. That's right.
It wasn't brown shirts. It wasn't brown shirts. It was Brooks Brothers.
Yeah. See, I think that's the mistake people make when they say calling this administration as fascist is overreaction, because they expect fascists to show up sort of as caricatures, as characters in this drama. You know, they should, as you said, be wearing brown shirts. They should act like Nazis. The truth is, in Germany, fascism happened incrementally, and it happened slowly over a period of years until Hitler simply took advantage of the soil in which those elements of fascism grew. So one of the features I think that people miss is also that any of these things that I mentioned, imperial expansion, racial solidarity, or strongman rule, individually aren't fascist or don't have to be. But it's when you put them together that they become fascism. When you put a strongman with racial solidarity, nursing racial grievance, with imperialistic designs, that's when you have a fascist state. And I think anybody with open eyes right now can see that's where we are. I mean, look at what's happening in Minnesota and other cities. Essentially, the Trump administration has invaded Minneapolis. They've invaded Minneapolis with what amounts to be a private army, willing to carry out the dictates of their strongman without any constraints. Um, and the administration has made clear there are no constraints in these people. So you put all that together, and we really are living with fascism right now.
The problem that we have is the problem of a defense mechanism called denial.
Mm,
People keep trying to disbelieve their eyes. We don't so many times we've heard people says, this is not who we are. This is not who we are. This is not who we are. Well, we said this is not who we are in 2000 when Donald Trump walked with General Milley and his coterie with black dressed, masked people through Lafayette Park, and peaceful protesters were brutalized. They said, this is not who we are. They said, this is not who we are when people were looking at Marines in Los Angeles
mm-hmm.
less than a year ago, or on the streets, National Guards in Washington, D.C., or Baltimore. But this is who we are. We're just in denial. And the problem is denial is a defense mechanism. It's something we do as humans
Yeah.
to protect our egos from accepting realities that are too painful to believe because they just do not fit our construct of what's right.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's important for people to call this what it is. I think it's important for people to call it fascism because, in essence, that's a reality check. That's a dose of cold water. That's a way, I think, to shock people into seeing things the way they are. Now, there may be people who only reluctantly will come along. I mean, the piece in the New York Times by Michelle Goldberg is a really good piece about fascism. But even at the end, she pulls her punches where she says, well, we're in the in-between period. No, we're not. We are there. And I credit her for writing a strong column, as she usually does. And maybe her editor said, pull your punch at the end. But the truth is, when you look at what's going on, there's no other word for it. What especially sort of shocks me goes back to your statement about how people kept saying, this isn't who we are. Well, if you pay attention to our history, it's exactly who we've been. I mean, the idea that
Exactly.
that somehow, we're living in a post-racial society, like a lot of people talked about after the Obama election, was just silly and naive. Um, the idea that somehow the institutions of government could prevent a strongman from taking over, the idea that we were never an imperial nation, all those things are ludicrous if you know our history. So those elements have always been there. The scary thing is Trump figured that out and fused them into his person and his movement.
I'd like to remind our viewers that in this quarter century, we're in now 2026, so we're
Mhm.
in the second year of the second quarter of the 21st century. We have invaded and toppled Iraq. We have invaded Afghanistan. We have invaded, well, we invaded Iraq twice because we had a war in Iraq twice. We have toppled the democratically elected president of Haiti, first, the first democratic slave rebellion liberation movement in the Western Hemisphere, and the oldest, of course. We toppled it, and nobody talked about the fact that John Bertrand Aristide was removed from power after having been democratic elected by agents of the United States and flown by the United States CIA to Africa, and he's there now, as far as we know. And now we've toppled Maduro. But
Yeah,
even before then, we were meddling in Vietnam, so Vietnam was an exercise in regime change.
that's right.
And so dating way back almost 70 years, our country has been doing this imperial movement, moving steadily into strongman notions of leadership and taking over other nations, predominantly nations that were not white: Vietnam, Iraq,
That's right.
Afghanistan, Haiti, now Venezuela. Uh, we're making moves on Greenland, which is white, but it's being viewed as a colony effort. But again, the strongman notion is
Right,
real.
right.
We have to understand that not only is this who we are, this is who we apparently have wanted to be. Because in every instance, those moves were met with either shrugs
Yeah.
or the notion that this made the United States look like it was vastly using its legitimate power in toward making the world a better place. We weren't. We were
Mhm.
just simply being an empire.
Yeah.
And empires always do this. I mean, imperial hubris is one of the realities of being an empire, and apparently we have gotten addicted to the hubris.
Yes. Um, your comments once again fuse those elements we've been talking about. I should just add that if you go back even farther, the Philippines are probably the best example of us being an imperial power. But we've had dozens of interventions in Central and South America going back to the 19th century. So our hands have never been clean that way. But the other thing that fused here is this sense of racial solidarity. It's this attempt to control people who are not white, and also this fusion of power into a single leader. Even beyond sort of the imperial notion, Trump has maximized the powers of the presidency and gone beyond that. The Supreme Court is ready to give him the power to control so-called independent agencies that Congress set up to insulate them from presidential interference. And Trump is attacking the chairman of the Federal Reserve, which is an independent agency. And what's interesting is people stood by, especially Republicans, and said nothing about all the other attempts of Trump to destroy the institutions. and obliterate the separation of powers. But you touch the money supply, and suddenly Republicans are like, oh no, you can't do that. It's okay to do everything else, but it's not okay to mess with money. And I think that's what's going on in Greenland. There's a lot of money there, especially if it thaws out. And I think there are eyes, the prize there would be the things you can mine from Greenland.
In addition to the shipping lines,
That's right.
in addition to the shipping lines, one of the things that comes to mind is that we dress this strongman notion up in wonderfully cryptic euphemism called the unitary executive.
Mm.
For
Hmm.
those of us who study constitutional law,
Hmm.
the notion of the unitary executive is simply legalese for uh, a monarch.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what a monarch is. A monarch is a unitary executive. And what we are seeing in President Trump's effort to control the Fed and to politicize all of the agencies. I mean, the FBI is theoretically supposed to be a nonpartisan investigative body within the Department of Justice that has its ultimate allegiance to the rule of law and the principles of justice and due process, not to any political party, let alone a political leader. But the FBI has been in this second iteration of the Trump presidency and was, I suppose, which was his claim or his intent during his first presidency, but which is why he fired Jim Comey.
Yeah.
He wanted to have the FBI as basically his private investigative body, just as he has ICE and the Border Patrol as his private militia.
Yeah. See, and that raises again this this fascistic notion. You have one man in control, but what he's doing is using the powers of government to punish his enemies, his supposed
Yes.
enemies. He's using the powers of government to crush dissent. Um, he's using the powers of government to create essentially a reality in which his word is the only reality. I don't think it's much of a stretch to go from the weaponization of the Justice Department and this private Gestapo of ICE to his attacks on university and programs like DEI and defunding public television and public radio, because he doesn't want independent voices. He wants a single voice shaped around his version of reality and his power.
I wish that we could say that we did not see this coming, but saying that would be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who read Project 2025, anyone who read it with a fair mind, saw that this was explicit. The control, the federalization, the politicization of federal agencies, the attacks on DEI, the attacks on liberation and justice, attacks on LGBTQ rights and inclusion, attacks on women and the freedom of women to control their own bodies, and the use of a hyper religious dogma to couch all sin so it comes across as somehow a morality play as opposed to really uh, an exercise in in okay, let me say it, being an ethno state,
Yes.
creating an ethno
Yes.
state out of what we've celebrated as being a pluralistic society, and to delegitimate the notion of naturalized citizens. So we now try to do away with the birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment
That's right.
for people who are the descendants of immigrants, who are the children of immigrants, and we want to we want to challenge the the loyalty, like we did during the Second World War with
Yeah.
Korematsu versus United States, of U.S. citizens who have ethnic backgrounds, so that we create this notion that you've got to be this blood and soil notion, um, that it's blood, white blood,
Yes.
uh, and soil, this soil, white blood controls this soil, and all others need to defer. Only other change I'll say is white male blood, because the killing of Renee Good took us to another level. I mean, I think about Viola Lusier, the white woman who was killed during the civil rights
Yeah.
movement. And she was killed because, as law enforcement says, she had no business hanging around with those civil rights folks. Well, now Renee Good's killed, a white woman. The problem is Ms. Lusier was killed in Alabama. She was killed in the South.
Hmm.
Ms. Good was killed in Minnesota. And the problem is Ms. Good was killed in our sight, video, and she was killed among white folks. And so we now have this ethnostate notion, which is also a male supremacist notion, a patriarchy.
Yes.
This is not, I will end by this. History shows this does not end well. Germany shows
That's right.
that this does not end well. Fascism only comes to power violently, and it always holds power violently, and it never leaves power peacefully.
Yes. And, your idea that they are really trying to create an ethno state is backed up by the propaganda coming out of the administration. If you've seen some of the things from the Department of Homeland Security and other federal departments, they are adopting Nazi frameworks and white supremacist
Yes.
frameworks in their Twitter feed and in their social media posts, even on the podium in front of Christy Nome the other day, was a phrase
Yes.
used by the Nazis. So they're
Yes.
not even subtle anymore about it, about their desire to create an ethno state. And Stephen Miller has pretty much said that, in J.D. Vance, right? We're not a nation based on an idea. Americans aren't creedal. That is, you don't become American by believing in something. You become American by having been here a long time, by being able to trace your ancestors back. And that's your blood and soil right there. So
It
we're
flies in the face of everything. It flies in the face of everything that we teach people in immigration classes.
That's right.
In immigration classes and naturalization classes, we are affirming the exact opposite. You and I have been to countless numbers of immigration ceremonies where those are the virtues, the values that are
Mhm.
extolled from the bench by a judge or by the speaker, that says, "Hey," and I think you mentioned Ronald Reagan once said, "You're not you can't go to France and be called a Frenchman, but you can come from France and live in the United States and be called an American."
Yes, that's right. And I think as we wind up here, again, I think it's really important that people use the F word. They
Yeah.
call fascism what it is. And we are seeing fascism played out. I just finished a book, and this is going to be my last comment, written in 1936 by Sinclair
Mm.
Lewis, called It Can't Happen Here. And the idea
Yeah.
was, how could a fascist takeover happen in the United States? And the key takeaway from that book is it happened because of a complacent citizenry that thought the end justified the means. It happened with a citizenry that was lied to about their condition and was promised a golden age that never came. And I think if Sinclair Lewis were alive today, I think he'd be saying, folks, it's happening again. I will say the last thing: the book does not end hopefully. Well, let me put it this way:
No.
it ends hopefully But it doesn't end with a happy ending. It ends with an ambiguous ending. It ends with the fascist state still in power and people resisting it. But it doesn't point to the outcome. It leaves it right where that was with the struggle.
I think that is the point where we need to leave it because this is about the struggle. And the question is whether we have first of all, the candor to admit that
Mm,
we are in a struggle. Do we have the candor to do what Michelle Goldberg could not do at the end of her piece, which it says, we are in a fascist era. We live in a fascist state. Are living under fascist rule. And then do we have the courage to resist? Do we have the candor to admit it, to overcome our defense mechanism of denial? And then do we have the courage to resist however we can by speaking out in spite of the pressures to be quiet, to standing up in spite of the pressures to look the other way, to stand in the way and say, no, you can't, or to insist, no, you must have a
mm,
warrant. You cannot compel people to do these things. And if I can say so, for local governments like Minnesota and others to sue, to use the
that's right.
courts and challenge the third branch of government to stand up and vindicate the rights we hold dear. Otherwise, the struggle will not happen. The courts can adjudicate these things if they have cases and litigants, but the courts cannot go out and bring these cases on their own. And it takes people like us to have the candor, the courage, and then the character to take these things
That's
on.
right. Amen. I can't add anything to that. So, Judge Griffin, thank you again. Um, Thank you for
Thank you,
all,
Dean.
all of you for listening. If you like us, subscribe. We're not going away. I hope you aren't going away either. So, Judge Griffin,
Please,
thank you
please
again.
yeah, please let other people know because we want to keep doing this, but we also want to know what you think about how we're doing it because
Yeah,
we believe in this. This is our way of having candor, courage, and character. Join us.
amen. Thank you.